Hi, I'm James McGuire, editor of Datamation, and our topic today is the cost of cloud computing. To talk about that, we've got three great experts. With us is Owen Rogers, analyst with 451 Research. Owen, how are you doing today?
I'm very good, thank you.
Good, and you are based in the UK, correct?
That's right. I'm in the historical city of Bath, which is very dark and wet at the moment.
Fantastic. And you also, I know you have your PhD, right? It's something related to cloud computing. Do you actually have a PhD in cloud computing?
Yeah, so my PhD is actually in the economics of cloud computing. So it was on derivatives, futures, and options used in cloud. So that was a couple of years ago now. So I've been working for 451 for about 18 months.
Fantastic. Also with us is Deirdre Mahone. She's the Chief Marketing Officer of Cloud Cruiser. Hello to you, Deirdre.
Hi, everyone. Glad to be here.
And could you give us, the short elevator pitch? What does Cloud Cruiser do for those who don't know?
Cloud Cruiser has a software solution, and we sell it to large enterprises or cloud service providers who are running the business of IT. So hybrid cloud and, in fact, traditional IT as well. So really helping enterprises migrate workloads to cloud and track usage by user and costs. So it's all about the money side of managing IT services in a hybrid cloud.
Sounds like there's a market for that. Also with us is Rob Bissett, Senior VP Product Management at Six Fusion. Hello to you, Rob.
How are you today?
Good, good. Are you in North Carolina, South Carolina?
We are, yep, Raleigh, North Carolina.
And explain to us, remind us, what does Six Fusion do?
So, Six Fusion basically specializes in consumption metering of IT infrastructure, whether it's private, hybrid, or public cloud. The idea to create a standardized way of saying how much computing do I have, how much does it cost me on a per unit basis to produce that, and what can I do to bring that cost on a per unit basis down. So lots of different use cases there, whether it's cost allocation, whether it's infrastructure optimization. But one of the things that we're very focused on right now is creating open markets for IT infrastructure. And that came out recently with our announcement with UCX to launch a commodities market for IT infrastructure for cloud.
Great. So the cost of cloud computing, it seems like there's a natural confusion going on there, and I hope we can clear that up a little bit. I mean, first of all, why is the cost of cloud computing so confusing? And on one hand, we hear a lot about price wars. How low will it go? Amazon and Azure compete with each other on price, but on the other hand, it seems like the cost of IT infrastructure in the cloud era have not gone down. So why is the cost of cloud computing confusing? Owen, what's your sense of that?
So I think a really important thing we have to understand is that the term cloud represents a whole bunch of services. We can't just say the cloud is virtual machines. We can't just say it's storage. In this day and age, cloud is a whole industry. It's a whole market of a variety of different services, all measured and used in different ways. So I think that provides some of the initial complexity, because if you're running an application in the cloud, you're not yet using virtual machines. You're also going to see line items for bandwidth, for database, for storage, for all these other components as well. So I think that creates the first initial complexity. And then there's also the complexity in the different methods used by providers in measuring and quantifying how these different services are consumed. And I think together these just make a big confusing mess of cloud pricing.
Deirdre, your take? I mean, it seems like there's part of the problem is there is not exactly one unit of what is cloud. It's not like going out and buying a server. But what's your sense on the confusion in cloud computing costs?
Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree with everything Owen just said. It's, I mean, it's still nascent. So the adoption of within the enterprise of hybrid cloud, whether it's hosted or public or private, it's still early days. Although the speed of adoption is definitely progressing. So I think 2015, as we approach that and into 16, we'll see much faster adoption. However, I think the initial attraction for IT to move to cloud is economically it's much more feasible in the long run. There's the scalability and the speed of getting up and running quicker, provisioning VMs in Azure or Amazon or wherever your choice is. But then I think the sort of when the rubber meets the road, and we actually see a lot of shadow IT as well. It's actually still very real. In a recent survey that we conducted at the Amazon Web Services event, 65% of respondents, of which there's about 300 respondents, said, yeah, we go around the central IT department. So there's adoption, but then there's this stark realization, oh, are we getting exactly what we wanted, depending on the use case and the business value that they felt that they were going to get. And then, before you know it, there's cloud sprawl, and then there's this, oh, hang on a minute, do we have actually visibility into what this forecast and this spend is going to be, not just today, now, but 6, 12 months down the road. Mm-hmm. So there's confusion there, and I think that people are, oh, maybe the public cloud wasn't the right move. Maybe we should do something private, internal instead. Maybe that's more economically viable. So I think people are still feeling their way, and as Owen said, trying to find out what the best solution is for their exact needs.
Rob, along the lines of the cloud confusion, do you hear from people like, hey, we thought cloud was going to be cheaper, but it's really not? And what's going on with cloud confusion in your eyes?
You see that a lot, and I think the fundamental issue is one of transparency, and that is that organizations of any size, I mean, SMB has one set of problems, but when you get into large mid-market enterprise customers, there's a very significant lack of transparency under what their internal cost models are. So there's a question of, hey, let's go to the cloud. Cloud's really expensive. Well, what is your internal IT cost? No idea. So that becomes one problem, is the juxtaposition of what are you paying now versus what would you pay in the cloud. The second then simply becomes a lack of transparency around cloud costing. So that is, how do I compare the cost of running XYZ workload across my internal and external venues to make a decision? And what we've discovered, or what we've really seen in the industry, is that these are not fact-based decisions today. These tend to be highly politicized conversations where a CFO or a CIO or a CTO has to choose between the internal IT guy that he's been working with for years and a cloud vendor that he doesn't truly trust. So I think the issue is not necessarily the cost of the cloud or the cost of the internal infrastructure itself, but rather the lack of clarity on what things actually cost, both internal and external, and then the transparency with which the decisions are actually made.
Well, that decision between the long-term IT personnel versus the cloud vendor, the executive doesn't know. I mean, is that strictly a cost versus personal comfort issue going on? I mean, is the lure of the cloud vendor cost alone?
Well, so I think you'll find that everybody's telling CFOs and CIOs they should go to the cloud, right? And cost is a part of it. Geez, it's cheaper. And our friend Joe Wyman at Cloudonomics, one of his laws of Cloudonomics is that it can be more expensive and cheaper all at the same time.
Right.
And that's just based on marginal waste rates. But the, from my perspective, this comes down to the CIO and the CFOs being pushed to the cloud because it's the latest and greatest thing. It's more agile, unlimited scalability, geographic replication, yada, 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 yada. But the CFO and the CIO really has no good sense of their internal cost of operations and their external cost of operations. Effectively, they're being lied to by both sides of the equation, right? Mm-hmm. They know that they're not getting the true story, so they both seem expensive. And there are, I firmly believe, and our evidence bears this out, that there are certain applications and certain levels of scale at which internal operations are more effective, cost-effective, than external operations. Right. The question is which ones and how do you figure it out, right? And that's where we're struggling as an industry.
Oh, and have you run into the phenomenon where the estimated cloud cost is greatly different from the real cloud costs? And I think it's happening quite a bit out there. And why is this happening? What do you think of the difference? What is the problem there?
So anecdotally, we do hear a lot about this concept of bill shock, where the CIO will open their cloud invoice at the end of the month, and they'll discover there is a line item on their bill which is far more than they had budgeted for, And obviously, it's a legal liability. They owe it to the cloud provider, and it's difficult to get out of that. I think with the cloud comes great power, but obviously with that great power, you need great responsibility. As Rob was saying, for me, the benefit of the cloud is the concept of scalability, is that you can increase your cloud application when you have demand, and you can meet all that revenue when it's being presented to you. But a lot of it is also scaling back your cloud when you don't need that capability there, so you can reduce costs. And I think a lot of the times, CIOs aren't really keeping track of how they're spending, how they're using the cloud, what resources they're using. And keeping a firm handle on that can mean that the cost won't spiral out of control. I think a lot of it is just down to the maturity of using the cloud. I'm not sure organizations are really set up to use the cloud in an efficient and cost-effective manner yet, but slowly and surely things are changing.
Well, on that same issue, isn't part of the problem is that the cloud isn't necessarily cheaper. It's being sold sometimes as cheaper, but it's a better tool, it's a more flexible tool, but it's not necessarily a cheaper tool. Is that your experience, Owen, or what?
Yes, I would agree, and I think really the concept of, it shouldn't really be regarded as a concept of cost, it should be the concept of value.
Right.
So if you have an application that is very steady, that never needs to scale, and that has 100% utilization on the server, then it might be possible that it would be cheaper to run on a private cloud. But if the application needs to burst, if it needs to gather new resources with changing demands, on a private cloud, it's much harder to do that. On the public cloud, you can just take that capacity when you need it. And I think that capacity is worth the expenditure because you should derive more revenue as a result of it. So for me, I think end users and enterprises should look at value rather than just cost savings.
Right. Deirdre, the difference between estimated cost and actual cost, and in particular, what about those bills that cloud providers can send out? I've never seen one, but I've heard horror stories about them. They look sort of like the phone bill with all these confusing line items. What's going on there?
You need a PhD like Owen to figure out and make sense of it.
Let's call Owen. Whenever we get a bill from Amazon, let's just all call Owen.
Oh, don't worry, they do.
They do. They do. Okay.
Yeah, it's usually the bill comes after the fact, with no sort of visibility into what's coming next month and the next quarter. So it's already consumed. So it's kind of like relevant to that shadow IT comment I had earlier. So people are frenzied. They're like, okay, let's fire up some Amazon services. We're a department, scan it on our credit card. Before you know it, every department in the business is doing the same. And the CIO gets the bill and the shock happens and cloud sprawl. And I totally agree with what Rob was saying is part of the problem is cloud has become this forcing function for IT to be much more on top of the finances and the cost aspects of adopting this new technology. And if they don't have an idea of what IT is costing them today, then they really aren't armed and dangerous to understand what's IT, whether it's externally hosted or running in Amazon or Azure, what's that costing us now and what will it cost us down the road? So just
I'm not sure I understood that. Are you saying the cloud actually helps a business understand costs? Or maybe I'm not hearing you right.
Yeah, it forces IT to look at, because it's pay as you go and it's on a consumption basis, it forces IT for this to have this major paradigm shift to move away from this yearly annual budget allocation based spend or budgeting across all functions of the business, and it actually forces them to think about it in a totally different way, which is because different parts of the business need to consume different ICT services based on what their projects are. So really it's having a different set of tools or technologies to run IT like a business. So what is sales and what is marketing and what is finance costing me now and down the road? And if they decide it's cheaper to run it in a public or private cloud, first of all they have to know what is it costing me today, but then what will it cost me if I choose HP OpenStack or if I choose Azure, or take your pick. So they have to really have those tools at their fingertips in order to know what's best financially and what's the economic advantage of moving to the cloud.
Rob, your sense of the difference between estimated costs and actual costs, and so that sticker shock with those confusing bills, what's going on there?
Yeah, well, so we actually see people struggle to get to the estimated costs. Obviously, getting to the actual cost is pretty easy, but we're starting to see a lot of actually cloud providers themselves running into challenges with the enterprise market. Of course, everybody's trying to run to the enterprise today to unlock the next wave of growth in cloud spend. But the enterprise is saying, well, we budget things and we allocate things and we contract things, so what is this going to cost? And that process of actually coming up with an estimated cost is actually problematic for the cloud providers themselves. And this is an area where we've been trying to help them, is to come up with an estimated cost that resembles the actual. And that's a non-trivial exercise when you think about, just take Amazon, right? 40, 50, 60, 70 line items on their price sheet, right? And you need to know, how many disk rewrites, how much bandwidth, but of the bandwidth, how much was local and how much was internet, how much of that is going to shift over. So I think if organizations were better able to plan these things ahead of time, they would have less sticker shock. The shadow IT problem, or the shadow IT movement, is what caused the movement to the cloud in the first place, and there was no planning. It just did. Right?
People with credit card, like divisions, like the division credit card, and let's get this going. Yeah.
Well, that's it, exactly. I mean, your financial audit goes back and finds you found out, $2-3 million in book expenses last year.
Okay. Minor costs like that.
But there's lots of organizations now that are over $1 million a month with public clouds. And it's a huge unaudited expense. Nevertheless, I think where the struggle is the lack of planning. If the CIO and the CTO could understand ahead of time, this is what it costs now, this is what it's going to cost, then they can start to track, the estimated to actual and the variance on that. But in many cases, historically, that step has been skipped, and as a result, everybody expects it to be cheaper, and it's not necessarily. Right.
Yeah. And we had talked about this a little bit, the idea of cloud commodity. It is cloud a commodity, and then where does it go in terms of exchanges? But I think the neat thing is you have come up with a model for actually cloud pricing, right, where you actually can do apples-to-apples pricing. Let's talk about that a little bit as we talk about the idea of exchanges.
Yeah, so I suppose it is an apples-to-apples comparison in some sense. The problem with tracking the cost of virtual machines and storage is that, in reality, an application will probably use a variety of different cloud services. So to analyze the change in cloud pricing based purely on virtual machines and storage is unrepresentative of the real situation. So inflation, so when governments assess inflation, they have the same problem. How do they judge how the price of things are changing? So they pick up a basket of goods. So these are the typical things a consumer would buy from the grocers every week. And by measuring how these groceries change in price every week, the national banks and governments can track how inflation is changing. So we've just launched a cloud price index, which is essentially a similar measure to inflation, but for the cloud market. And in our basket of goods, we have the typical specification of a web application, which includes storage bandwidth, virtual machines, different types of database, DNS services, support, all of these typical things that an enterprise might want in a standard application. And we're going to go to cloud providers every few months whenever price cutting takes place, and we'll ask them to re-quote our basket of goods. And in that sense, we'll be able to measure how the real price of cloud is changing over time. And in our first incarnation of this, we found out that our application was $2.56 an hour. And that would include everything you need to run quite a powerful web application.
That's pounds, that's dollars?
That's dollars, that's dollars.
Okay.
Is it Canadian, Australian, or American?
US dollars.
All right.
US. But we'll see how this changes over time. So Google announced some price cuts a couple of weeks ago, and their price cuts brought the index down maybe 3 or 4 cents. And I was expecting Amazon actually to reduce prices at reInvent a couple of weeks ago, but they didn't. So we'll have to keep watching the industry to see what will happen in cloud pricing and to see who will cut prices next and how that will affect the index.
Right.
Yeah, that's you get into some fun economics there, but ultimately what you're trying to deal with is information, asynchronous information, right? The cloud providers know a lot more about pricing than the buyers do, right? Amazon knows what the average price is across all of their clients, but no client has the way to understand what other people are paying and what their discount levels are. This is actually an emerging problem in the enterprise, is that there are large enterprises, tens of billions of dollars large enterprises that are saying, well, I want a discount because I'm this big, right? Well, how do you assess the discount? Because there's an information asymmetry. So the cloud pricing index is a way to do that. And that's part of the reason that you're going to see the movement to exchanges. And we can talk about commoditization. You got two economists on the phone. We'll talk about this all day. But part of what you'll see with that movement is centralized price discovery, and that alone will create a level of transparency that will address a lot of the cloud cost issue.
Deirdre, what's your take on is cloud a commodity, or is it headed that way? And if so, are the cloud exchanges going to play a serious role in terms of how cloud is priced?
Yeah, I mean, I think based on what we're seeing today in the market, it's not a commodity. There's aspects of cloud services that are commoditizable, so storage and VMs. But I think because all service providers are providing slightly different mix, or as Owen said, the basket of goods is slightly different. So there isn't a standard across all of the providers, and therefore that causes confusion, and to the advantage of some of the main providers, because they can differentiate and adjust their prices and get into this price war that we see today. The reason Owen needs to keep on top of his cloud price index is because it is constantly changing. So there is an element of price wars going on, and I think until there's some standardization, and then commoditization will follow thereafter. So it's also advantageous for some of the behemoth strategic players because they have critical mass. So, like Rob was saying, they have an advantage where they actually fully understand, they know how they're going to make money, and they fully understand what their costs are. And, as they scale and grow, they have a bigger advantage over the smaller regional geographic players. So, across Europe, it's made up of thousands of distinct, geographic specific players because of data sovereignty, which is a key critical element that we don't face every day in the Americas. But I think there's commoditization will come, but it's a ways off. I think we're a couple of years away from seeing any commoditization, and it will be very specific units that will be commoditized.
Yeah, certainly the consumer price index, the U.S. government CPI, is famously inaccurate because the basket of goods is only somewhat representative of what real people buy. So I'd be curious to see how the cloud price index shapes up over time in terms of the cost of cloud versus how the CPI cloud price index actually tracks that. Owen will be watching, in other words.
So definitely, and I wonder if there's I think maybe as time goes on we'll look at other applications and other locations as well. So I am keen to emphasize that the cloud price index is a benchmark to measure how relative changes are happening rather than an absolute measure.
Right.
And just back to Deirdre's point, I completely agree. I think virtual machines and storage, yes, I think they are approaching a commodity state, but there are some differences in region and in other features. But cloud providers are so much more than just these basic quantities. It's all the other services they sell that have the differentiation. Yeah. And it'll be interesting as well to see how the cloud price index changes in terms of what's in the basket. Right. Because looking at all the announcements the different cloud providers make in terms of new features, I'm sure we'll have to reassess what a typical application is over the next 1, 5, 10, 25 years.
Right.
Well, and this is where I would argue that cloud is absolutely a commodity. The question is, how do you define cloud? And this is to the point that the others do. So if you look at there are two leading cloud exchanges, and I won't dwell on them a whole lot, but Part of the reason that they're driving in this particular direction is to say that there are elements of this industry that are absolutely commoditized. If I build a 1 gig of RAM, 1 CPU, 4 gig of RAM machine, put Ubuntu Linux on it, attach it to the internet, you couldn't tell the difference, right? And by definition, that makes a commodity. So the question becomes, how do you define the commodity classes? So there will be a commodity class. There is a commodity class called infrastructure as a service. And if you define that as running a free Linux distribution and with an internet connection and with no SLA, right, that is a commodity, right?
But the infrastructure as a service providers might argue with you and say, hey, but my service is different from that other infrastructure
well,
service
sure,
provider.
sure.
Yeah.
And tomato soup from different vendors tastes different, but it's still tomato soup.
Yeah.
This is my point. But then you subdivide that class called infrastructure as a service into geographic regions: U.S. West, U.S. East, right? UK, Western Europe, Eastern Europe, Asia Pac. And then you subdivide that into, say, there is web scale infrastructure as a service with no SLA, and then there's enterprise grade infrastructure as a service with SLAs. And then within enterprise grade, you're going to have a regulated and a non-regulated class. So when you think about commodities, it's not just commodity, right? Tomatoes are a commodity. Okay, if you make ketchup, you don't care what kind of tomatoes. But if you make pasta sauce, you want Roma tomatoes. But those are also a commodity, but they are a subclass of the commodity called tomato. So yes, cloud is infrastructure as a service is, storage as a service is, or can be treated as a commodity. And that's why you see Amazon and Google and Microsoft racing to the value-added services, because the infrastructure as a service and the storage as a service is effectively the gateway drug, right? That's what gets you into the cloud, right. And then from there you migrate to the database services and to the DNS hosting services and the messaging services and the queuing services that are non-commoditized, and that's where they're going to drive their higher margins.
So Rob, are you saying that you basically have the raw materials, or the commoditized elements of the raw materials, but you still need to put them all together to make an actual viable, valuable business service?
Absolutely, yeah. There's a difference between the commodity raw material inputs. Infrastructure as a service is a commodity raw material input, right? Infrastructure as a service is not a web app. Mm-hmm. Right? You can use infrastructure as a service to build a web app, absolutely.
Right.
And that's the trick. When you talk about the commodities and is cloud a commodity, well, yes, elements of it absolutely are. Does that mean people will consume it as a commodity? Yes, in part. But they're going to couple that with on-premise. They're going to couple that with code. They're going to couple that with value-added services and bundle those to create valuable business services. Absolutely. Mm-hmm. Right? But if you think about today, where this gets really interesting, one of these large banks in New York or insurance companies are spending hundreds of millions or billions of dollars on infrastructure, just physical servers. And that's a 7-year commitment, minimum. If you can treat that as a commodity and hedge that risk in an exchange, then all of a sudden you've taken a multi-billion-dollar asset that's going to depreciate faster than GAAP and move that off balance sheet. And what that means is that your company can now focus on the value-add aspects of creating that valuable business service. Not to get too far into the theory of that. As I say, you put two economists on the phone after.
We can get down on the weeds. I guess yes. What I would say is let's look into our crystal. Well, looking ahead, I mean, speaking sort of what you're talking about, 2 to 4 years from now, God forbid, 5 years from now, a few years out, what do we see, cloud pricing going? I mean, what are we going to be talking about when we talk about cloud pricing, 2 to 3 years from now? Oh, and what will the conversation be like?
Well, I suppose, a question I get asked a lot is how low will cloud pricing go?
Right.
And I think it comes back again to this point that cloud represents a whole bundle of different services. Now, it could be possible that something like virtual machines and storage, they become so cheap to operate and they become so competitive they have limited margin. Perhaps they'll start approaching zero. Perhaps they'll be given away by the cloud providers. And then obviously the cloud providers can make their margin, can make their revenues through the upsell of other services. This kind of model works well in other industries, so razor blades, for example. Typically, when you buy a razor from the drugstore, that is being sold at below cost. It's the purchase of the razor blades later on, that recurring revenue, that actually makes the profit for those companies. So I think it's completely possible that in the future we will see that cost go down to zero for some cloud services. But the whole commoditization issue, I think, terrifies service providers because they hear this term commoditization and they think that means the natural end of differentiation and the natural end of their business. Yeah. But that's actually not the case. Just because some cloud services may be commoditizing and in the future may be commoditized, it doesn't mean that there aren't other opportunities to add value and to make higher gross margins.
What in a nutshell are some of those key opportunities?
So I think really moving up the stack. So if we look at Amazon Web Services announcements at reInvent, they started moving away from infrastructure. They started adding value in terms of platform as a service components. AWS Lambda is a good example. So I think further value can be added by looking at the platform and looking at the management of the application. But also in terms of complexity, having a broad portfolio of different products that are well integrated together can add value, as can working with multiple cloud providers and aggregating multiple services across the globe together can be a good way to add value.
Deirdre, the future of cloud computing, I guess it's just, Alibaba is going to buy everyone and that'll be probably it, I guess. By 2016, 17, Alibaba could acquire Amazon and they'll make it very simple, I guess. I'm sorry. What's your take on the future of the cloud costs?
Well, I think I agree with everything that's been said. There'll be aspects and sort of the raw ingredients of infrastructure will be commoditized, but we're already seeing new as a service, so business as a service. So a lot of the behemoth communication service providers are actually building their own cloud services business. So they're, they already own the networks, for example, so they are now building, cloud capabilities for their downstream customers. So we're seeing cloud not be a mechanism to run your technology services, but actually transform them into making money for, larger businesses. So I think that there's a whole new wave of business services via the cloud, whereas, probably fast forward 4 or 5 years from now when we talk about cloud, we won't focus in on cloud per se, we'll talk about the layer of services that are provided. It's just another way, it's another infrastructure, it's another technology vehicle. It'll be what is being served and how is that being served downstream.
Mm-hmm. Rob, you're taking the future of cloud computing costs? What we'll be talking about a couple years from now?
Yeah, I like all of the points. I don't think we'll see a race to zero. Marginal cost will never go to zero. As demand increases, right? We're going to see disruptive technologies come in there. So we will settle on a market price. There'll be a small number of providers that dominate that market. We're going to see huge differentiation with people around compliance and regulatory performance needs. We're going to see differentiation on maybe bare metal offerings. You see companies like Rackspace with their fanatical support. That is an absolutely valuable differentiation. So by no means does this mean the end of the market as we know it. What it means is that there'll be a baseline element that people are going to support as a commodity, and then there'll be all of the value-add platform as a service, software applications, development, all of those things sitting on top. So I definitely see that. I definitely see the financial markets developing. Just the dollar value of investment in infrastructure and cloud is too high for there not to be risk management mechanisms.
You mean exchanges?
Yes,
yeah.
We'll see that move forward. Again, does that mean that if you need 2 VMs, you're going to go to exchange? No, right? But what it means is that brokers like Dell will be buying on exchanges and then parceling those up amongst the SMBs, with their cloud marketplace, effectively, things like that. So there's going to be a lot going on there. I also think that you'll see another cycle of innovation in the hardware. So we will see a cycle of innovation in hardware where you will have non-commoditized infrastructure investment to optimize the delivery of the commodity, right? And if that doesn't bend your brain, nothing will. And that may lead to another shift to on-premise infrastructure, right?
That's a lot. That's an interesting view of the future.
So
everything's full circle in technology.
we'll see what happens, right?
Yes.
If you look at infrastructure as a service as purely a commodity, then the hardware vendors are going to rush to engineer hardware that can deliver commodity cheaper than other hardware, and that may lead to a cycle of reinvestment on premise. We'll see.
All right, it's going to be interesting. I thank the three of you very much. It was interesting. Great comments, and I will send you the link so we can all tweet it. Thank you very much for joining.
No problem.
Thanks, James.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Bye-bye.